So I'm here with Carl Benjamin. He is a candidate for the European Parliament running for the UK Independence Party. He's also a YouTuber better known as Sargon of Akkad. That might be where many of you are familiar with him from. So we're going to be talking about big tech censorship, the Brexit campaign and what's going on with that, and various controversial comments that Carl has gotten in trouble for. So before we get into the questions, I think it's probably necessary to caveat the interview by discussing how the interview will be discussed. So I think the way the mainstream media sees themselves when they invite you on their shows on Sky News and BBC, they see themselves as crusaders against hate, holding evil, hateful misogynists to account. The way they'll portray this interview is a evil, hateful Breitbart reporter giving platform to another evil, hateful misogynist. And they'll say, this is just a softball interview and so on. But I actually don't believe in asking softball questions, even to people who I might agree with on various issues politically, so I will ask some tough questions. What I won't do is ask Piers Morgan tough questions, which is when you ask a tough question and then spend 5 minutes yelling at the person you just asked the question to so they can't answer. Yes. But there will be some tough questions.
That's fine.
So let's get into the one the mainstream media has discussed the most, your comments about Jess Phillips. So this is the one that Piers Morgan would not let you answer in full. Why do you think it's okay to discuss whether you would or wouldn't rape someone?
Well, Jess Phillips is the one who constantly brings this subject up. And at the time, this was like 3 years ago, when she was taking part in a campaign called Reclaim the Internet, which Ella Whelan of Spiked magazine described as an insidious and Orwellian attempt to restrict speech under the name of free speech. And what I was doing is just demonstrating that if I took a statement that was a categorical, you couldn't describe it as a threat. It's categorically not a threat. It's a threat. It's a statement of non-action.
What was the exact thing you said?
I wouldn't even rape you.
Right.
And it was a very rude thing to say, but that's why I said it, because I knew that it would prick their ire somewhat. They wouldn't be able to resist responding to it. Because at this point, Jess had already had me blocked, because I'd tried to interact with her because of the way she dealt with Philip Davies previous to this. But the whole point, and you can see it in the video that I attached to the tweet, was in the video I said, look, I can say anything, even though I'm not going to do something, and they will parlay that into a threat and claim that this is them being threatened, which of course they have done. They've proven my point precisely.
I said, explain the Philip Davies thing, because that's somewhat linked to this, isn't it?
Right, yeah. Philip Davies was trying to table a debate on men's issues in the Parliament under the guise of, well, we have a debate on International Women's Day about women's issues, as we should. Why should we not have one on men's issues on International Men's Day? Jess Phillips laughed at the idea, and she claims that she personally didn't block it, which may well be true, but I read her book. I know that she's, as she says in her book, so there's a feminist sisterhood, in her words, that she leans on to get things done. And you can see this in an interview that both she and Philip Davies did with the BBC. This is going back to like 2015, 2016, or something like that, where she's just laughing in his face and talking over him and teasing him about the fact that it was her friends in Parliament who managed to get this pulled off the table because of some kind of minor administrative error in the paperwork, and a form of what I would say is malicious compliance on her part. And she's being very, offensive is the word that most people will use to describe the way she was behaving towards him. And Philip Davies didn't deserve this at all. He's a very mild-mannered man. He's a gentleman. I'm not, so I'm happy to push the issue because, frankly, I don't see how this is going to get done either way.
I see.
Either way.
There are issues which are important to men and women. I feel like rape is sexual assault of particular importance to women. Is laughing at men's issues, which is what Jess Phillips did, as bad as making a rape joke to a woman?
Well, I would say so, yes. Because, suicide is the number one killer of men under 45. Men die younger, they have a lower quality of education, they end up, and women under 30 now out-earn men under 30, and it's really that men are falling behind in society. And of course, feminist harridans like Jess Phillips don't care about it. In fact, they crow about that, they're very pleased about that. And, well, I'm sorry, something just has to be done. We have to stand up to this kind of bigotry.
They're pleased about male suicide?
Pleased that they are the ones controlling the dialogue. That's the joy of it, the power and control. That's the thing they're pleased about. They will do nothing to help men with their issues. They will pathologise them as being toxic, and they will say that all masculinity is evil. And in fact, masculinity, I've seen feminists trying to claim that it's a form of terrorism. And I mean, personally, I'm on the side that we actually need more masculinity returned to the homes, because I am in agreement with David Lammy, in fact, on the issue, say, of gang stabbings in London. In 2012, he put it down to fatherlessness in inner city communities, and I think he's completely right. I think that young men need male role models in their life. You'll never find a better male role model than your own father, and so we need to essentially return to family values to prevent these things from continuing.
Right, and I want to get onto the whole issue of gender and whether society cares more about men's issues or women's issues in a second, but first let's talk about context.
Yes.
So we're both, pretty supportive of free speech.
Yes.
Always keen to see the context that renders, seemingly unacceptable statements understandable.
Yes.
But we often don't talk about which contexts what context exists where we'd say, actually, no, that's a messed up thing to say. So, in what context would you say a rape joke is not acceptable? I would like most normal.
In any polite context. Like, I mean, my channel is not daytime television. If you have if you're not signed in on an adult account, or like an account for an adult on YouTube, you can't see any of my videos. It's not daytime television, and it's not for children, which is why the average age of my audience is 30. And so if you've got a channel where I'm a well-known political commentator, and I use a lot of levity in what I do, because frankly, if I don't laugh at a lot of the things that happen, I'll probably end up crying. I use humour to disarm dangerous and powerful things. And so people are aware that my YouTube channel effectively has the kind of atmosphere of a comedy club. And so in that kind of closed environment where someone has to go and find it to view it, I think that's acceptable if you've created a space for that sort of thing. I mean, if I was being broadcast onto public television in people's homes at the middle of the day, of course that would be inappropriate. Of course it would. But that's just simply not the context in which this has been done. And
right.
So, I mean, by the same standard, we'd have to condemn every comedian in the country.
Yeah, I think that the way people often view you or portray you, if they disagree with you in the mainstream media or whatever, is that you're just a bomb thrower who'll say everything regardless of the context.
Yeah, no,
but
that's
actually, you do believe there are some contexts where it's not appropriate to say certain things.
Of course, but I also think that there must be context created in which it is fine or acceptable, not necessarily appropriate, but acceptable, to say things that are otherwise rude or provocative or something like that, because that's what a free society must have.
You think we can't say it now? Why do you believe that?
Oh, because of the Twitter hate mobs and the media hate mobs that go out of the way to get everyone fired or deplatformed or harassed in the street. I mean, look at Danny Baker. I just don't believe that he had a racist intention in his mind when he tweeted that. I mean, he's an old working class man, so I think he was probably looking at this through a class lens. I don't believe he had ill intent when making the joke that he made.
What joke did Danny Baker make?
He tweeted out a picture of two royals with a chimpanzee that was dressed up, and he was, I don't know, making some sort of class-based joke that honestly is from a previous generation that I didn't get, to be honest. But I don't think he was making a joke about race. But there are people who believed he was making a joke about race, and so they decided to whip this up. And I saw on Channel 4, there was a chap who began his speech with, I come here not to praise Danny Baker, but to bury him because of his racism. And it's like, well, yesterday no one thought he was a racist. He tweets out one joke, and that's his entire career and public persona erased.
I see. And presumably, like, he says he wasn't trying to be racist.
Of course, yeah. He's defended himself, but they're not interested in listening.
But, so, like, let's go through some context where it would be unacceptable to say certain things. So if you, like, yell the N-word at a black person out of hostility, that's obviously racist. We can agree on that.
And that would be illegal anyway.
See, many people on the left would say, anyone who's mildly right-wing would agree with that, but actually, no, it would be unacceptable and racist.
Of course, and no one questions that,
So, like, I remember actually after the Trump inauguration, someone went to a protest, an anti-Trump protest, and held up a sign saying "Rape Melania," and that was just someone doing it because unprovoked, because they didn't like the Trump administration. Yeah. And that's a case where if I feel like you're doing something out of hostility and you're deliberately using things that are designed to hurt someone on the basis of their sex or their race, and it's purely malicious and there's no provocation and there's no wider point you're making, that probably is unacceptable.
Well, I totally agree. And they can't find an example of me doing anything like that. I've never said anything like that to anyone. It's always been abstract and for a greater sort of meta point that I'm making around the way that the dialogue is conducted. Obviously.
Right.
Polite society, you don't do this sort of thing. But isn't it interesting how every statement that has ever been made is extracted and presented as if I've burst into their dinner party and started yelling insults or something. Which is just not what's happened. I mean, Jess Phillips has never actually seen any of my statements firsthand. She's always heard about them second or third hand from journalists.
Right. So we've agreed that saying the N-word to a black person out of hostility to hurt them on the basis of their race is unacceptable.
Of course.
You've used the N-word. Why did you think it was acceptable in your context?
Because I was insulting Nazis.
You were insulting Nazis using the N-word. Explain
that. The way they view the world is, and this is not BuzzFeed, my opinion, the way they view the world is that, well, they believe black people are inferior. And they believe that black people are genetically predisposed to be aggressive and violent and savage. And the way they were acting to me at the time, I was currently...
And they use the word N-word to describe that.
Of course, that's the pattern of behaviour that they're describing. And at the time, I was being relentlessly attacked by these people because I wasn't agreeing with their narrative. I refused to agree with what these Nazis were saying. And honestly, no one cared. There was no recourse from YouTube or the press or anyone like that. And so I was reduced to saying, right, okay, what is it I can do to drive these people out of my communities? And well, I can start insulting them for doing the exact thing that they accuse other people of doing, to prove that they are no better.
Using their own hate words against them.
Exactly, yes.
Right. And the alt-right, they hate you, right? They don't like you at all.
Of course, they can't stand me. Because I'm anti-identity politics and they're identity politicians. And this is why Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris pulled their Patreon accounts in defence of me. I mean, Sam Harris was very clear. He was like, well, it was obvious he was being attacked, and he was obviously trying to insult the people attacking him and not just some random person on the street. And I thought that was a very fair and principled way of describing it. I think
so you're actually not a right-wing populist, are you? You have more in common with Sam Harris.
Yes, yeah. I'm an acolyte of the Four Horsemen. I think that they were broadly correct on many issues. They're a bit more left-wing than I am. I'm very much a centrist, but I'm also quite libertarian. I do believe that people should be autonomous and self-reliant and should have, they should be the ones in charge of their own destiny.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to context and the use of words, I almost feel like whenever we have a conversation about it, it's almost quite childish and people are being treated as children.
Yes.
Because learning how to use words and when to use words is something a child does, it's not something an adult does. And I feel like most people understand context. So people on the fence who may not agree with you but also don't think you hate women and want them to be raped, or people who might not agree with Jeremy Corbyn but also don't actually think he hates the Jews, they're probably feeling quite exasperated right now.
I imagine that there has got to be a limit to outrage culture, because that's what this is, and that's what Twitter has brought to the public dialogue. This kind of offence archaeology that, I mean, for example, the Ben Shapiro interview with Andrew Neil the other day. Everyone thinks that this is some tremendous loss for Ben Shapiro, but by the same token, it was a tremendous loss for Andrew Neil as well. I mean, bringing up tweets of his from 2012, it's irrelevant. I'm not interested in what Ben Shapiro said in 2012. I want to know what he said now. What does he think now? I mean, who agrees with themselves from 5 years ago? You've clearly undergone no intellectual development if something you've said 5 years ago is truly something that a conviction you hold today.
So moving on from gap controversies and statements and context,
outrage.
onto a topic that might create some new outrage. Let's talk about gender.
Right, yes.
So Jess Phillips, I believe, has said she actually broke down in tears at one point because of the abuse she was receiving from your followers. First of all, if that's true, that's not good, right?
Well, I've always, unlike the media, I actually go out of my way to encourage people not to contact any of the subjects of my videos, and I always have done. I've actually got it in the description of my YouTube channel. I've made many videos saying this because I, as someone who has received his fair share of ire from the media and various progressive people like Jess Phillips, I get a lot of her activists coming and saying nasty things to me too. It's not pleasant, but the thing is there's very little you can do about this when you're a public figure with a public profile and there are lots of people paying attention to you. You can't be held responsible for what other people do. They have to be held responsible for their actions. But you should try to mitigate any kind of they call it dogpiling. When a mass of people are suddenly engaged to go and speak to another person because of something they've seen. I've always said, please do not contact these people. It doesn't benefit us in the slightest, and it just hurts them. And I don't want to hurt them, but I do want to have these conversations, and I know they're tough, and I know that they've got a vested reason not to have them, but they have to be had.
And you'll do that, presumably you do that for men and women. So this is the other question I want to get to, like equal treatment for men and women.
Yes.
That's something you believe in?
Completely.
Okay.
I think the state should be completely gender blind. I don't think it should have an opinion on gender.
But it seems to me that the media and society does not always see it that way, or at least maybe they think they see it that way, but it doesn't seem to be the result. So
Yes.
one of the topics that's come up with your case is the online harassment of women, and it's often portrayed in the media as a particular problem faced by women.
Yes.
But studies have shown, Pew did a study, I believe, several years ago, showing that men and women are about as likely to be harassed online, receive online abuse, but women are more likely, by a significant margin, to be upset by it. So we talk about equal treatment for men and women, but are we treating them equally?
Well, no, and the source of the online abuse comes equally from men and women as well. I mean, often when you use sexual shaming language, like whore and slut and things like this, they often come from other women because women are aware of just how barbed these insults are, because they're attacking their integrity and honour as a woman with power, because women are powerful. They do have power in society. They have power over men. And feminists would abnegate this completely. They would suggest that women have no power, they are just the victims of society, and that's just not true. But there are other studies that show that, for example, when it comes to politicians, male Conservative MPs receive twice the amount of harassment online than, say, Labour female MPs. And if you're a person of colour, then that number actually goes down. So it is the straight white males who actually do receive the vast majority of online abuse.
That's totally contrary to what the media would have you believe.
Why
do you think it is?
I assume it's because they don't spend as much time complaining, because I think there is a higher expectation on them.
Well, are you saying women and minorities complain more, or just women?
Well, you said that women are more sensitive to this.
Right, yeah, women are. The studies show that women say they feel more upset
Yes.
by online abuse than men do.
And I've got no doubt that they do. And I'm sure men don't feel as upset. But I think there's also a social expectation on men not to play the victim in this regard, not to make a big deal out of the fact that a lot of people are saying harassment. So
Well, let's get to the root of this, because
Right, okay.
You just said, like, it's socially unacceptable for men to show they're upset. So Jess Phillips said she was crying over this online abuse. I feel that's sort of acceptable for women to do. If male politicians said they were crying over online abuse, what do you think?
If I had said it, I think I would be mocked and ridiculed.
Right. And do you think that's how it should be? Do you think
I think
there should
that's
be more
how it
equality?
is, whether it's good or bad. I don't think we can change that. And I think there is a social expectation that men are supposed to deal with this better. And I think a lot of men don't deal with this better. And I think that no one is particularly sympathetic to that. And honestly, this again comes down to the sort of feminist narrative where all bad things are done by men and all good things are done by women, and all victimhood is owned by women. Women will shame men just as much as they shame one another. Women are not helpless or infantile or anything like that. They are more than capable of speaking their mind and making their feelings known. I mean, a lot of the sort of masculine gender roles are in effect created by women, because what we consider to be like the sort of apex male example, that's something women find very attractive. So we're evolutionarily driven to be that thing, because it's most attractive to the largest number of women.
Well, men and women drive each other's behaviours in this way, don't they?
Of course, yeah, exactly. It's not a one-way street, but we just happen to be talking about the male gender role. Women, of course, for the female sort of gender role, it's exactly the same in reverse. Men are most attracted to a certain kind of thing, on average, and this drives the species forward.
What do you think men and women actually want here? Because we know a lot about what politicians and the media want. They want this utopian ideal of equality.
Yeah.
Do men and women actually want to be treated equally? Do men want to be able to cry and be vulnerable and all that stuff?
No, I don't think they do. I think that the majority of men and women are actually very comfortable with their gender roles, and they actually quite like the way they've been set up, because they were not created by design. These things came about holistically. They were generated from thousands of years of men and women just trying to get by together. Because it really is like Jordan Peterson says, the historical narrative that feminists use regarding men and women is totally counterfactual. It's just not true. It's not that men were trying to oppress women and women have been trying to escape men or anything of the sort. That's nonsense. I mean, there was a pamphlet that went around at the time of Charles I, where coffee houses were opening up and women's husbands were going to these coffee houses and talking politics. And the women petitioned the king for their ancient privileges as women to have these coffee houses shut down because their husbands weren't at home. and they were calling on ancient privileges then. So it's not one of competition; it's one of cooperation between men and women.
Yeah,
and that's where the feminists are going wrong.
Going on a tangent here, we're both sort of history nerds.
Yes.
You're probably aware that the code of chivalry was not created by men. Created by Christine de Pizan and I believe Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Yes, and it wasn't really focused around women either. It was around chivalric conduct between knights.
But also how knights would treat women.
Of course, yeah. There was an
aspect of that.
Of course, it's a small part of it. Yeah.
It also sort of like, I'm constantly frustrated by this idea that there's never been female empowerment in history before the 1960s. Yes. So you go all the way back to the 1300s, you've got women creating the code of chivalry. It had a huge impact on European society. Also, female protagonists in movies, you see them in the 1920s, you see them in ancient Greek mythology, and yet whenever there's like a female superhero, it's seen as this revolutionary
new thing,
the first one ever.
Yes. Well, what's really interesting, one of my favourite stories is Richard the Lionheart intended to marry his sister to, I think it's Saladin's brother or cousin, because he wanted to secure a peace treaty and start making political inroads in the Holy Land, and she just flatly refused, obviously on the basis that she, a Christian woman, is not going to marry a Muslim man, and she just flatly refused. And it's like, well, if women were so oppressed, how did she manage to refuse the King of England? It can't be just one-sided in the way that feminists would like to portray it, and I really do think it was, people forget how difficult the past was. It's very easy when we're in an era of mass communication, mass production, human rights, to sit there and say, well, it must have always been this way. But that's a very privileged way of looking at it, because before, it was a real struggle just to see the end of the day. People died very young, it was brutal, there was no rules of warfare or anything like this. And so it was just a different world where people just struggled to get by.
I feel like the headline about this interview might be Carl Benjamin and Allum Bokhari say there was no sexism in the Middle Ages. obviously there was.
Yeah, no,
but what I want to get to here is...
that's actually a really interesting point, because what it was, it's not that it wasn't sexism, it's that society was very stratified hierarchically, and there were very clear sets of rules and codes that men and women had to follow, and if a woman broke those codes, then yes, obviously, anyone around her, any other women would put her back in line. But the same goes for men. If a man didn't do what was expected of him, then everyone around him would have put him back in line as well.
I feel this all comes back to the same root, and there might actually be a new way of looking at history here. We might be onto something. We were talking about how men don't like to be seen as victims. They don't like to cry. They're ridiculed if they are.
Yes.
There's another study I wanted to cite. It's called Empathy, Gender Effects in Brain and Behavior. It was published in the Neuroscience Behavioral Review in 2015.
Right.
And it found that women tend to empathize with other women and men about equally.
Yes.
But men are more likely to empathize with women than they are with other men. So, also, one of the things that triggers empathy is crying. Women produce far more of the hormone, I believe it's called proclotin, that makes people more likely to cry. Again, a stereotype that seems to be somewhat confirmed by biological evidence. But this sort of victimhood gap, we see it today in the fact that women's health charities tend to get more donations than males' health charities. People went after you for saying, pretty mean things, some people say unacceptable things about Jess Phillips, but Jess Phillips was also laughing about men's issues like male suicide. That's also as serious, at least as serious as rape.
She actually described the Cologne New Year's Eve attacks as the same as an average night out in Birmingham, which strikes me as, at once, obviously ridiculous if you just look at the statistics, but secondly, very Islamophobic. Because, we were talking, the Cologne attacks were Muslim immigrants who had done this, and there's been a lot of Muslim immigration to Birmingham, and they do not do the same thing there. So why is she basically painting Muslims with the same brush? It's very peculiar.
But going back to talk about how history is perceived with regards to men and women, has there always been this victimhood gap? Are we more likely to see women as victims in history as well as in the present?
I think so. I think it's an innate part of human nature. I think there's a reason that the knight is always trying to save the princess from the castle.
Well, damsels in distress have been popular throughout history, but
the oldest stories in the world.
But men in distress are usually comical figures, right?
Yes, yeah, it's dismissive,
and it sort of underpins everything, including the debate over female representation in popular media and so on. And again, going back to the idea of men and women being treated equally, I think you're right that in many cases that would be a nightmare. I don't think anyone wants to live in a world where men are wusses and women are just totally, never show weakness at all.
Well,
but
what I find interesting is actually Game of Thrones, the way that this has been portrayed, because you'll notice that in the last season, the women have been portrayed. They've tried to portray them as strong, independent characters, but really they come across appearing tyrannical, as if they're not prepared to listen to anyone else. And this is not how I believe women lead, but I believe that this is how the sort of stereotype ends up being formed. The idea that this is how men lead, and men don't lead that way. And I think that, honestly, people in the media who are trying to represent strong female characters are doing the women in these series, and particularly Game of Thrones, a disservice. Because I was a very big fan of the female characters, because they'd all been through the fire, they'd all been through their tough experiences, and that's the character forming part. But in this latest series, all of that has been ignored, and now these female characters are being treated as if they've got invulnerable plot armor and they can't possibly be hurt. And this is not a realistic character. And I think it's just being done because they are women in positions of leadership in order to make them look invincible. But that's not how we would write a man. And I think that's a distinct difference that's essentially being played out before our eyes, as it were.
It's a tragedy that George Martin can't write fast enough.
It's awful. Awful.
But going back to unequal treatment, so I think we all agree, like one of my liberal female friends went to Sweden, I think it was a while ago, like 10 years ago, and she was, like, she's like feminist, but she was shocked that no one would hold the door open for her. And that's anecdotal. I'm not sure if Swedes are actually less likely to hold the door open for women, but I think like that's an area where you say, okay, it's unequal treatment is fine, that's nice. But there are other areas that maybe we should be aware of our biases a bit more, like the male suicide issue, like
education levels. I mean, women are now the most educated people in the country, which is great, except that it's actually coming at the expense of men. Men are falling behind, they're being ignored. Classrooms are being feminized as if men learn better in this environment, which they don't, and we've got the statistics to show this. And so I think that a bit of care and empathy could be put aside for these young lads who don't have fathers in their homes, don't have a schooling system that actually works in the way that they need, and are just being ignored by wider society and pathologized as being oppressors of women. I don't think they are. I think they're young men who need guidance.
And this gets to like something that actually progressives talk about it, and like identity politicians talk about, is being aware of certain ingrained biases.
Yes.
And I think, would you agree that we should be aware of those for men and women?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's never just one way.
But also take a more nuanced view of it and saying, having that bias is fine if you're opening a door for someone. It's not if you're setting, budget levels for cancers.
Absolutely, and we've got laws to prevent this kind of bias from exhibiting itself. And you can see this by the BBC with the Carrie Gracie scandal about gender pay gaps. The gender pay gap is basically due to the fact that women work less on average, fewer hours on average than men do. And so when you find yourself where women work, say, 15% fewer hours than men and receive 15% less pay than men, I mean, it really is not about... And the thing is, the BBC, they had 3 independent investigations. They just couldn't find any evidence of sexism. But this is the feminist narrative on full display. It has to be sexism. It can't be something the women themselves have done, and they can't take ownership of it, and it can't be a consequence of their own agency. Whereas, in fact, I think all the evidence suggests that it is. And it's fine for women to have that kind of self-determination. Personally, I don't see why anyone would want to spend all of their working hours chained to the desk in the office anyway. I think it's very sensible that women do less overtime. Why would you want to do more overtime?
Let's talk a bit about tech and big tech bias.
Yes.
So you were quite recently demonetized by YouTube.
Yes.
All advertising revenue stripped from your channel.
Yes.
I think it puts you in the same boat as Tommy Robinson and Count Dankula.
Yes.
So, first of all, did they give you a reason for doing it? And second of all, how badly did it impact your personal
life?
livelihood?
Well, they did it over a joke. Obviously, it does deeply impact me because the majority of my funding was coming from my channel. So that's quite a problem, but I'm sure I will be able to work past it. And maybe YouTube will see it in their hearts to consider that maybe demonetizing someone's platform over a joke, and it was a silly joke video. It was marked as comedy. It was a blooper reel of jokes. It obviously wasn't, meant to be offensive or as taken literally or anything like that. Maybe they'll see it.
Not just a joke, but a blooper reel joke.
It was a series of outtakes from a previous video that I've made. And maybe they'll find it in their hearts to remonetize my channel after considering my side of the story. But so I think it's.
Why do you think they went for the whole channel, not just that one video?
I have no idea. I guess we'd have to ask YouTube. But I think it is part of a demonstrable pattern that targets Trump supporters. Because I've been a Trump supporter for a while now. I wasn't originally, but he persuaded me around because he did a great job. And so now I'm a full-throated Trump supporter, and I think that we're coming up to the 2020 elections, and I do suspect there's a great deal of political bias involved here.
And if you don't mind me asking, what was the joke? How bad was it?
Well, it was the Jess Phillips one that we were talking about.
Oh, the Jess Phillips one, I see.
Yeah.
Right.
This was the consequence of media pressure.
Right.
So YouTube have essentially caved into this kind of media narrative, regardless of the truth of it, just because there's a great deal of hysteria being generated.
So the joke was made on YouTube. Because it's interesting that tech companies have started to ban people, not just what they do on their platforms, but also off platforms as well. It's sort of become like a test of your virtue as a whole, not just in their particular property.
Well, it's interesting how that gives them claim to all of your behaviour. No matter where you are and what context you are, no matter what you're doing, they are now the moral arbiters of your behaviour. And if they're not happy, if there's enough media kickback about something that's happened, they won't stand their ground and say, well, according to our terms of service, he's done nothing wrong, which, according to the terms of service, I haven't done anything wrong. They'll instead bow to this kind of pressure and bow and scrape and do the politically correct thing.
It's like getting thrown out of a pub in England for insulting someone in an Australian pub 6 months ago.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
So what sort of policy change would you like to see either here in the UK or in the US to make tech censorship less viable?
Well, because of the location of Silicon Valley, it'd have to be done in the US. And personally, I would like to see some kind of digital bill of rights that guarantees what we can effectively call like the right to a digital trial, perhaps. I think that this is something that the tech giants themselves would probably agree to. So I actually kind of feel bad for the CEOs of the tech giants at this point. You can see on their faces with like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, you can see they've created a monster that they find themselves riding on top of, and they're not sure how to handle it. But what I would like to see is the decision-making power about who gets their accounts banned taken away from the platforms and actually delegated to a jury with an actual judge of some form.
Couldn't it just be like a regular court? Why can't you just take social media platforms to court and get your account reinstated?
Well, I would actually like to have to go through a legal procedure to get them suspended.
Right.
Because it is at the moment a digital death sentence. Once they say, no, we've decided, for whatever reason, good or bad, and you've got no recourse, you've got no way of actually getting that back. And it's always the worst possible outcome at the first instance. Milo Yiannopoulos has tweeted at Leslie Jones, quick destroy his, ban his Twitter account. It wasn't one strike, it wasn't a trial, it wasn't a warning, there's no recourse for Milo, he can't get that back, under a promise of reformed behaviour. It's the worst. If this was a legal trial, it would be just a tyrannical king beheading people in the marketplace. So
I sometimes like to compare it to property. So a landlord is not allowed to simply evict you. He has to get a court order, doesn't he?
Yes.
And that's because your property is valuable to you.
Yes.
You've invested time and money in it.
And your social media accounts are definitely your property.
Right.
They're definitely something you've created, that you've built up, that is your presence. And not only that, I mean, there are wider implications for it being...
and they're also worth something in the same way that physical property is worth something.
Obviously. I mean, make a lot of people a lot of money. But it's also the ethical question of who gets to decide who does and does not speak. And at the moment, it's a handful of billionaires and their activists in Silicon Valley, and I think that's tyrannical, frankly.
And also, there's a wider issue here which goes beyond just social media platforms and tech giants. It's the denial of service in general. We're sort of seeing, I think, like an ideological Jim Crow, in which people are being denied access to banking, to credit cards, DNS registrars, even restaurants, over their political viewpoints. What do you think of that trend? What do you think can be done about that?
I think it's really disturbing, and it is actually the path towards fascism, because what the fascists always complained about the liberal state being a night watchman. it was just there to guard people's rights. It wasn't there to make a better society. That was down to the individuals who lived within the state. The fascists instead set up what they considered to be an ethical state, where the state itself had an ethical agenda and would mould the population in order to fit this agenda. And that goes completely against what I believe it was Adam Smith who suggested that the moral good of capitalism was the anonymization of the market. You didn't know with whom you were trading. You didn't need to know, which meant anyone was free to go into any business and then exchange their money and goods for goods and services, which makes a much more fair and moral society. It means that people can't simply be targeted by groups of people within society or by the state, and it means we can all actually live in freedom. So going against this, forcing companies to take ethical stances against individuals, I think is clear the clear sign that we're on that kind of path to a more tyrannical society, and I think that we should definitely oppose this wherever we see it.
And the answer to Jim Crow was civil rights legislation. Do you think that's the answer here as well? Should we make political viewpoint a protected class in the same way that race, sex, and sexual orientation is?
It's the last thing that I want to do, but this kind of censorship just cannot go on forever.
Right.
I mean, at the moment, religion is treated as a protected class, which is terrible, because if you think about it, like, Britain is the home of religious tolerance, purely so we could critique one another's religions. The idea that this is now a protected class, I mean, Christopher Hitchens would be spinning his grave, surely. This is the worst thing, this is the antithesis of liberty, and so if we can't critique ideas, then we're out of options. Where does politics go from here?
There are three arguments I find especially simplistic on this issue. First is the argument that, free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences.
Well, actually, that's what it's meant to mean.
Isn't that exactly what it means?
Yes.
Like, going to prison is a consequence.
Yes. I mean, what they mean, and they never make this distinction, but what they mean, we're thinking legal consequences and they're thinking social consequences. Well, fine, you guys can unsubscribe from my channel if you didn't like my joke, or you can subscribe if you did like it, or you can decide to not come to a venue that's hosting a live event of mine. But by the same token, that I shouldn't be investigated for a joke. Nobody should be investigated for a joke.
Right.
Nobody should be going to prison for throwaway remarks that they're saying on social media. And yet they are.
But don't you think the distinction between a government punishing someone for speech and a private corporation punishing someone for speech is a little bit overwrought? Because wouldn't you rather pay you shouldn't have to pay a £50 fine for speech that doesn't harm anyone, right? But wouldn't it be better to pay a £50 fine? Wouldn't you rather pay a £50 fine than have your entire YouTube channel demonetized?
That is true.
What harms you more, right?
I would prefer to pay the £50 fine, yes.
Exactly, because they're both consequences.
Yeah.
Does it matter that one's imposed by a corporation and one's imposed by the state?
The consequence should be the opinion of the people who saw it. That should be their consequence. And then they should use the market to associate as in how they choose. They shouldn't be able to destroy someone's livelihood or lifestyle or anything about them just based on something that they've said. I mean, they should just choose to spend their money elsewhere, or use their clicks and viewership elsewhere. Live and let live, in my opinion.
So would you say that your position is that free speech isn't necessarily freedom from consequences, but too harsh a consequence, whether it's private or state, and you don't have free speech anymore?
I think that's true, and I think that's what John Stuart Mill was saying in On Liberty. Because, I mean, one of the interesting things about On Liberty is that he spends very little time actually addressing state tyranny, and he spends a lot more time addressing the tyranny of society, which in his day was run by the church. In our day, it's run by intersectional social justice advocates.
The secular church.
Yes, it is. And it operates in very much the same way. I mean, I had a conversation with he must have been about 19 years old lad on one of these town hall style meetings that I've been doing. And he was just giving me the evangelical Christian argument as well, that there are some subjects that are just taboo, which we shouldn't talk about. And I was like, well, that's a very conservative position. Obviously, he didn't consider himself conservative. And it's interesting how with the left have finally arrived at that place where they're saying, no, these things are taboo and you simply can't talk about them.
It is a bit like the church, but in a sense, is the church actually somewhat, even in their authoritarian phase, in one sense better, in one sense at least better, in that they always had a big emphasis on redemption.
Yes.
What I find interesting about the tech company bans is that they have all these policies for banning people, they have no policies at all for reinstating people.
Yes.
So, neo-Nazism, white nationalism, these are all, abhorrent ideologies. We disagree with them. I personally don't think anyone should be banned for lawful speech. But if these tech companies are going to ban people for lawful speech, and then someone recants their views, becomes a liberal progressive, says, I've made huge mistakes, I'm not a racist anymore, etc., etc., these companies don't have any sort of path to redemption for that person.
They don't, and that's a scary society, because that's a society that's going to be very much on edge about what's been said, especially when it hasn't always been like this. The sort of noose of what's been politically acceptable is becoming tighter and tighter, and as that becomes tighter, old things that were tweeted out when it wasn't such a restricted environment now become deplatformable offences in this new, very honestly tyrannical environment that we find ourselves in. And yeah, there is no redemption, and that's a scary idea. The idea that you can make one mistake, one joke tweet from however many years ago could ruin your entire life. That is if ever I've
forever,
seen
no way
forever,
back.
Yeah, with no way back. If ever I've seen a good reason not to use Twitter, that's it.
And I think it gets to the heart of freedom of speech and freedom of consequences. I personally think there are some consequences no one should face, even for speech that's abhorrent and objectionable, as long as it's lawful, doesn't incite violence.
Of course.
But we're at another level now where we're saying not only are we going to impose harsh consequences on them, but we're also never going to take them back, even if they change their views.
Well, this is why I describe it as a digital death sentence without a trial, because it is. Honestly, it's quite terrifying, especially every morning, every single morning. I wake up and the first thing I do is check to see if my channels are still there, because I don't want to hear from someone else that my channels have been taken down. I want to see it myself. It's honestly a very scary time.
The other argument that frequently frustrates me here is that we shouldn't ask the government or regulators to get involved in big tech because it's a free market. You hear this from conservatives a lot. You should just build a competitor to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. What do you make of that argument?
The problem with that is that social media is very interesting. I've been watching the rise and fall of social media platforms for some time, and as soon as Jack Dorsey described himself not as having invented Twitter, but having discovered it. And I do agree that that's essentially you're discovering a path of what is effectively some kind of addictive drug. And that's what people use. The people who use Twitter, they use it in a particular way. And so, millions of people who liked it go onto that platform. Unless a new platform does something different that Twitter can't provide, there's no particular incentive to use a new platform. So either way, you're kind of stuck with the monopoly on what that platform does. For example, there are lots of alternatives to Facebook, but you've never heard of any, because there's no need. Everyone's on Facebook, and if the social media you want to talk to people, you've got to go where other people are. And if there's a platform that doesn't hold any other innovations other than just being a copy of Facebook, there's no incentive to use it. And so you're left essentially leaving Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as the dominant market players, just because that's where everyone is.
It's also not a free market, is it? Because these companies have a particular privilege, at least in the US, they have this legal exemption from user-generated content. That's a perk they get from the government.
Yes.
And the reason they got it was specifically to preserve a free internet.
And also, you get the alternative platforms are openly persecuted. Look what happened to Gab. Andrew Torber has been an absolute hero in keeping Gab and Dissenter online, because they have been defunded, deplatformed, openly harassed, openly maligned as being a Nazi platform. Something couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, this is what people also often don't know about.
Yes.
That people have tried to create alternative platforms, and what happens is credit card companies won't process their payments. Hosting companies won't give them space on the internet. DNS registrars won't give them a web address.
And so the free market, which should be anonymised, as Adam Smith suggested, to enable a free society, has actually become a Mussolini-style ethical market, where they're actually engineering society as if they know better than everyone else. I think that's terrifying.
Interesting that you say Mussolini style. So how did Mussolini do it?
Well, that was exactly in the Doctrine of Fascism that Mussolini wrote with Giovanni Gentili. The purpose was to create a totalitarian ethical state. So nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. I probably messed up that formula, but essentially
ethical in the view of fascists.
Well, ethical is in the view
objectively ethical.
Well, no. Objectively ethical, as in it has an ethical agenda. Whether you agree with that ethical agenda or not is completely different. But the point is, it was deliberately compared to the anonymized marketplace of capitalism and the neutral institutions of liberalism to an agenda-driven marketplace. Well, a totalitarian society that had an agenda that it was actually pursuing. The average person probably doesn't want to have the government have an agenda for their life that they're going to try and incentivize and force people into, and using state force, coercion at the very least. So it's honestly, it's genuinely disturbing that no one else seems to be picking up on this.
So this whole apparatus we see in modern corporations, corporate social responsibility, you're saying that has some ideological affinity with actual fascism?
Oh, absolutely. It's exactly what the fascists were asking for. And in fact, in many ways, I think it's because it's being driven by socialists. Because a lot of, honestly, if you look at fascism, all it essentially is an honest version of socialism. It always ends up in the same way. It wants complete state control of the economy, complete state control of the press, end of freedom of the people inside it, and they need, ends up with like gulags, death camps, all this sort of thing. It's all very, very similar, and it just seems that the fascists were like, well, yes, we're going to need this to implement what we think is the ideal state. I mean, I think there's a reason that all of the fascists were socialist first, and the fact that Mussolini said socialism is a dead doctrine because you couldn't achieve what the socialists want without going down the route of fascism.
Speaking of fascism, there's a sort of war by elites on the people at the moment, and I think the war on internet freedom is part of it. So in the beginning, the ideal of internet freedom was everyone gets access to this new global public square. It was actually celebrated as a global town hall. That was a word that was frequently used.
Jack Dorsey described it as a human right.
Precisely. And now it seems all the emphasis by elites and the mainstream media is an attempt to restrict access to that public square, to make what was previously an equal playing field unequal. And this is sort of like the whole elite attitude at the moment, right? Isn't it? If something allows the masses to express their preference, it's bad. And I wrote a whole article about how the attack on crowdfunding sites and social media platforms, and why movie review sites are being asked to remove user reviews, why referendums aren't being respected. It's all part of this idea that allowing ordinary people to express their preferences right now through any means is dangerous.
Yes, it's because they have an ethical agenda. They believe that they have the received moral wisdom of the radical left, and that this is the only moral standard, and therefore anyone who objects to this must be some kind of Nazi, or some kind of racist, some kind of misogynist. It's not that you can have principled opposition to the ethical agenda that they're trying to enforce. It's that you are just simply a bad person and you need to go to the gulag.
And if a majority opposes him, then the majority is wrong and has to be dealt with.
Precisely Maduro's opinion, yes.
Well, let's get on to Brexit now, which is obviously a big part of your campaign.
Not as big a part as I would have hoped, actually. I don't get
Right.
asked about Brexit very often, but I'd love to talk about it, yeah.
Well, this actually gets me onto this might be another tough question for you.
Yep.
So there's been a schism in pro-Brexit politics that Americans Americans I've talked to don't really get at the moment. There's now a Brexit party being led by Nigel Farage, and there's also UKIP, which used to be his previous party being led by Jared Batten, and that's the party you're a candidate for.
That's true.
So I can imagine a Brexit party activist saying, they sympathise with your battles over free speech, against tech censorship, media smears, but the issue of this election is all about Brexit, and it's the only issue they want to talk about, and they don't want it to be distracted by other issues. And by the way, if I had a Brexit party activist here, I'd be asking him a different question. I'd be saying, well, why aren't you talking about free speech and all these other issues that are important to populists?
Totally fair question.
But do you understand the previous position?
Yeah, I do, but honestly, I view the Brexit Party as a bit of a stunt by Nigel Farage. I mean, it has two members. Nigel is the party leader and Gwaine Towler is the treasurer, because that's the legal minimum to form a political party. It doesn't have any members, it has supporters and allies, and it's no surprise they haven't produced a manifesto, because there's no manifesto that's going to satisfy Claire Fox and George Galloway, as well as Anne Widdecombe and Nigel Farage. These are,
But isn't that the point? Isn't it a single issue party?
Well, yeah, but that's exactly the point. As soon as the issue's over, the Brexit Party is gone. There's nothing that it's going to win. And honestly, I would be amazed if it lasts that long. And really, and I keep saying this, like, it's an election for MEP candidates, and anyone who knows anything about the European Union must know that the MEPs are actually relatively powerless. The best they can do is amend legislation that the Commission gives them. I mean, if an MEP was capable of delivering Brexit, Nigel Farage would have done this 20 years ago. It's simply not on the table. And so it's kind of smoke and mirrors.
Wouldn't the Brexit Party say, well, it's precisely because MEPs have no actual power that let's just treat this as a referendum on Brexit again, and vote for Brexit is just Brexit and nothing else?
Well, you can vote for a party that literally only has one issue, or you can vote for a party that also has that issue and a bunch of other issues, like free speech and concern about Islamic extremism, concern about social justice, and going back to more sort of fundamentals like English identity is mentioned in the UKIP manifesto. Now, that's an important topic. There's no doubt that the English have an identity crisis at the moment, but no one will talk about it. Well, that's what UKIP's here for. We're here to have those tough discussions. Brexit was one of them, and obviously UKIP was responsible for making Brexit happen, and obviously we still want Brexit. There's no question of it. And we're actually, if you actually look at what's going on now, I mean, the European Union is refusing to deal with Theresa May at this point. The Conservatives have accepted a framing in which they have no leverage, and so they've been constantly ground down, and they are being totally ground down. And 80% of businesses in this country are ready for a no-deal Brexit. So if we have the chance, we should just leave. We should just leave.
Actually, I want to get on another issue that Americans sometimes find confusing about British politics. We have a Conservative Party in power at the moment. They've been in power for past 3 or 4 years now alone, and before that they were in a coalition, but they've been in power for quite a long time now. They're called the Conservative Party. Are they actually conservative in any way?
They're a Labour Party. They're alt-Labour.
Alt-Labour.
Yes. For any Republicans in the United States, you'll probably know them as rhinos. In name only. All they have done is conserved Tony Blair's Labour reforms of the British state. The hate speech laws, various other sort of politically correct things, and the increased Labour spending and immigration that was introduced to the country. I mean, it was Tony Blair who opened the borders. We currently have 640,000 people coming in with a net of 300,000 a year staying, and we have social services. I mean, as Milton Friedman says, you can have open borders or you can have social services. You cannot have both, and he's completely right. One will destroy the other because it's basically a pyramid scheme. We've got 300,000 people who come into the country who have not paid anything into the social services they will then start taking money out of, so that's a burden on the taxpayer. And as they stay and start paying tax in their own turn, more people come in, and that's a burden on them. And so it really is a pyramid scheme. It has to stop somewhere, and it will stop with the collapse of the NHS. And I'm a supporter of the NHS, but I'm also a supporter of a much more stringent immigration system, so we're not putting so much burden on the taxpayer. But the Conservatives will just keep throwing money at this without closing the borders, because they are preserving the Labour-created status quo. They are not right-wingers as the Americans understand them.
This sort of gets to the heart of politics at the moment. It's not so much a divide between left and right as it is a divide between populists of both the left and right, and neoliberals in left-wing parties and neoconservatives in right-wing parties. There are still a lot of influential neoconservatives in the Republican Party.
I mean, we can just broadly term them globalists versus patriots, I think. People who think that the nation-state is a good idea and should exist, compared to the people who think that the nation-state is somehow a problem to the integrated open border world that they'd like to create. I mean, you see Guy Verhofstadt, not just on Twitter, but in various interviews saying, wouldn't it be wonderful to create an African-European Union superstate? And I'm just sat there thinking, well, A, that's a very imperialistic attitude. You're looking at other territories and thinking, wouldn't that be good to add to ours? And B, do we think there'll be no problems if we extend the Schengen zone to Africa? I mean, honestly, it's just absurd. And honestly, mildly terrifying, the kind of visions of grandeur that these bureaucrats have in their head.
There seems to be a massive cognitive gap and a lack of understanding of history when it comes to both immigration and these transnational projects. Because if you look at history, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, they all collapsed and were destabilized because they tried to unite various very strong national identities.
And not just that, I mean, the Western Roman Empire collapsed because of German immigration. I mean, the Romans had obviously treated these people terribly, but they did end up allowing all of these tribes into the Roman Empire, and it did end up causing the collapse because these tribes essentially sacked their way across Western Europe. It's about the respect of the place that you're going to. For example, there are lots of Indian and Pakistani immigrants who came here in the 60s and 70s, who came here when the immigration allowance was a lot more stringent and more restrictive, and they came to Britain because they thought, oh, Britain's a good country, we like this country, we respect this country, we respect the people in it, we respect the history and heritage it has, and we want to be a part of that, and they've been welcomed in with open arms. But now you can see communities in the north who, under the Tony Blair immigration reforms, don't come to this country because they think it's a good thing, and they come because it's economically advantageous, but they want to preserve the culture of the place that they've come from. And I mean, if you look at the culture of Pakistan, you can't help but notice it's very theocratic and patriarchal. I mean, they have blasphemy laws, and then Twitter, in fact, has to enforce Pakistan's blasphemy laws. And Majid Nawaz was recently alerted that Twitter had managed to get him in trouble in Pakistan, where he has family, so now he's actually in danger if he goes back there, because of Twitter alerting the Pakistani authorities to something that Majid had tweeted again like 5 years ago that has come back to bite him. So,
well, I'm well aware of how authoritarian Pakistan is. My own father had to flee the country because it was being ruled by a dictator who didn't like his journalism.
Well, the worst part is we treat the most radical versions of Islam as if they're normal in this country. I mean, many Arab countries ban the full-face burqa because it's extreme. It's a radical thing to have for women to wear. I don't see why we can't take their advice on that regard, because what we're doing is we're essentially saying, yes, it's okay to come over here and be a radical Islamist. And I really don't think that's a mindset which should be proliferating.
It's always almost like the elites can't really see their own bias here, because they live in a world where, people come in from all across the world to Davos, they meet up every year, they mix in this very identityless, rootless environment, and that's fine if that's what they want to do, but they don't seem to understand ordinary people for whom identity is important, and also they don't seem to understand psychology. So we've known since the 1970s that people will fight over the tiniest things, even like the colour of their shirt or their favourite football team. If you look at British history, the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish, the English have been fighting forever, and they calm down for a while, then they start fighting again, then they start calm down for a while, they start fighting again, because these identities don't go away and they're a source of conflict. So and we can say that's not great, that's not good, doesn't lead to good outcomes, but it's how humans are, it's the reality of the situation. So it seems to me just totally asking for trouble to introduce more and more identities, more and more potential sources of conflict, even if you admit that, even if you believe that everyone's equal, everyone should have equal opportunities. If you introduce more identities, you will have eventually more conflict. That seems to be a fact of human nature.
I think it's very good of you to describe it in terms of competing identities, because I really think it is. And if you think about what an identity is, what it is, a package of values that are summed up in a word. Certain kinds of values for certain different civilizations. And when you find people who are very strong in their identity, and these people come into conflict, then what you're actually describing is a conflict of what is the good. For example, there are going to be many people from Pakistan who believe that submission to Allah is the good. That's the right way to live your life. But of course, this totally conflicts with, say, a working class English person who thinks that freedom and fairness are the good. And that's just not a compatible system of values, that you can't have both. And so someone has to win and someone has to lose. You can't simply expect these communities to not have any disagreements. And really, I think that the term multiculturalism is actually very pernicious. What we are actually talking about is multiracialism. Because I don't believe that culture comes from race. I genuinely don't believe that, and I think that's the same narrative that the Nazis actually had. So your culture is generated by your innate genes, whereas I think it's actually, honestly, mostly a product of your environment. And I think, people like Martin Nawaz are a great example of that. To me, he's a very English thinker. He seems like an Englishman in every way other than just his skin colour, which I don't care about. But conversely, you get someone like John McDonnell, who thinks that England is a horrible place, and he's a horribly collectivist thinker.
Seems more like a Latin American politician than a British one.
Yes, he does, which is why Jeremy Corbyn phoned up Maduro a few years ago and congratulated him on the revolution. They think in a very foreign way, and these things are not confined to race. So, we should say we're a multiracial country, but we should be a culturally British country, because this is Britain.
Well, I would actually go more simplistic than that. I'd say that people fight over all stupid reasons, because it's like, I feel if you take it as too negative view of human nature, you'll eventually get to an authoritarian place, and that's also one of the things behind tech censorship. People now this very negative view of ordinary people. They'll get deluded by fake news, they'll vote for the wrong people, they'll become racists, and we have to control free speech because of it. I think people are not perfectly rational, but they also learn over time.
I think they're generally good.
Right. You don't think they're perfectly rational?
No, they're not.
Right.
Most people are not perfectly rational.
And I think the way that comes out in sort of identities is simply people can get over it. I think elites have largely gotten over it, but they don't understand that it's still part of human nature. It does recur, and the more differences you create, the more potential sources of conflict you create.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question of it. And again, it really does come down to the fact that it's different value systems that are coming into conflict. We should have a base value system that is the British identity. And I think that should be promoted to newcomers. They should be encouraged to become British, become like us, because I think we're very accepting of foreigners who are like us and who want to be like us. No one ever complains about Sikhs and Hindus and Gurkhas in this country, do they? No one complains about them, because they do appreciate the British system of values and want to integrate into that. But if you've got a competing system of values that openly rejects them, which is honestly what half of our mosques are controlled by Deobandi Islam, which was a philosophy of Islam that was founded in direct opposition to British liberalism in India by Muslim scholars. If we allow that to proliferate in our mosques, then we're allowing an actively anti-British version of Islam to become the norm in Britain. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down. There are lots of other versions of Islam that don't do this. This was specifically founded to be an anti-British version. I would much rather if the British state would take ownership of this and say, well, look, we're going to have to promote a different version of Islam that doesn't actually hate this country.
I feel like free market libertarians often, this is the Koch brothers argument that people are just economic units, there's nothing else to it. But I mean, most people would think it would have been mad to say, allow 1 million hardline Bolsheviks to emigrate during the Cold War, because what do you think would happen?
Yes, exactly.
And it's not about race, it's about ideas.
Ideology, yes. Totally agree. I mean, yeah, exactly. During the height of the Cold War, you'd never accept millions of Russian immigrants. You would be like,
well, you might accept Russian refugees, but like not actual hardline Bolsheviks, right?
Yeah, so you know, these people who are wearing a hammer and sickle on their shirts, you know what you're getting into there.
Well, we're talking about the divide between elites and the people. Can you explain to Americans what the hell is going on with Brexit?
Yeah, the Conservative in name only government is too afraid to cut the cord because they're worried that 10% of the economy will evaporate overnight. Well, 80% of businesses now are ready for a no-deal Brexit. The European Union is not prepared to deal with us at this point, really. They're not giving us any concessions, they're not going to give us any new deals, and we can't get Theresa May's, what is generously termed the surrender deal, and also accurately termed that. It would be better for us not to leave and accept Theresa May's deal, and we voted to leave. So we are just in a position where the only option is just to leave without a deal. But the Conservatives are too cowardly to do that because they're afraid that there's going to be damage to the economy, that they'll be held accountable. Even though they could always just say, well, listen, we handed sovereignty back to the people for the referendum. You told us what to do. The European Union is not prepared to cooperate on these regards, so we have no choice but to leave without a deal. This is us fulfilling the will of the people. And I think if they owned it like that, then they'd come out stronger on the other side, even if some people lost their jobs.
What amazes me, and I think will amaze many Americans who now have these ballot motions at elections that are basically referendums, mini referendums.
Yeah.
The idea that elites would openly be campaigning to overturn a referendum that's already happened.
It's pretty shocking, isn't it? And not just elites, just foreign powers. I mean, Guy Verhofstadt is campaigning with the Liberal Democrats now to overturn the result of the referendum. I mean, that's foreign interference, is it not?
Yeah, German interference.
Yeah,
We're worried about Russian
Belgian,
interference.
actually. But
Belgian.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all being financed by the Germans, so...
So final question. We started with some tough ones. Let's end with a fairly easier one. What happens if you win? What will be your priorities? What will be your priorities, the Sargon of Akkad agenda in the European Parliament?
Right, well, again, we have to come back to the problem that MEPs actually can't do all that much. And a lone MEP can't do all that much. So essentially, I'll have to do a similar sort of thing that Nigel Farage did, and use it as a bully pulpit to be able to give, because you get a 1 minute long speech in the House, and so I'll have to pack a lot of very triggering things into that 1 minute to drive conversations on issues that are difficult but necessary to talk about, that I don't believe other politicians frankly have the moral fortitude to raise. And these will be raised. And obviously, whenever it comes down to a vote, I'll obviously vote in Britain's interests, obviously. I don't really need to say that, but yeah, the primary thing will be raising the alarm on certain things that otherwise politicians, especially the politically correct politicians, wouldn't touch with a barge pole and would pretend that don't exist.
A platform for more free speech, then.
That's correct.
Well, this was Carl Benjamin. I'm Allum Bokhari, and check this out on YouTube or Breitbart or wherever it'll be.
Thank you very much.